On a frigid morning in January 1983, Robert James Callahan clocked into his shift at the Ford Rouge Complex in Dearborn, Michigan, carrying his lunch pail and a thermos of coffee his wife Patricia had prepared before dawn, completely unaware that the routine act of walking past Bay 7 would reveal something that would transform him from an ordinary assembly line worker into an accidental participant in one of the most sensitive counterintelligence operations ever conducted on American manufacturing soil. The massive industrial cathedral around him, with its rivers of molten steel and thundering presses that had built tanks for 2 world wars, harbored secrets that morning that would make his 23 years of reliable, unremarkable service suddenly matter in ways he could never have imagined. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Robert Callahan was 47 years old that winter, a second-generation Ford employee whose father had worked the same assembly lines during the company's glory years when Henry Ford's revolutionary production methods had changed not just American manufacturing, but the entire industrial world. Robert had started at Ford in 1960, fresh out of high school with a strong back and a willingness to work the kind of hours that built middle-class security. He had married Patricia in 1962, bought a small brick house in Lincoln Park 3 years later, and raised 2 daughters who were now in college studying nursing and education. His life followed the predictable arc of post-war American prosperity, built on union wages, overtime shifts, and the certainty that honest labor would be rewarded with stability. The Rouge Complex, where Robert worked, was more than just a factory. It was an industrial empire spanning over 2 square miles along the Rouge River, a self-contained manufacturing universe where raw materials entered at one end and finished automobiles emerged at the other. At its peak during World War II, the complex had employed over 100,000 workers. By 1983, that number had declined significantly as automation and foreign competition reshaped American manufacturing, but the Rouge remained an impressive monument to industrial capacity. Blast furnaces, steel mills, engine plants, and assembly buildings stretched across the landscape like a mechanical city, connected by miles of conveyor belts, railroad tracks, and overhead catwalks. Robert worked in the engine plant, specifically on the line that assembled V8 engines for Ford's truck division. His job involved installing cylinder heads, a task that required precision, speed, and the kind of muscle memory that came from repeating the same motions thousands of times. He could perform his work almost unconsciously, his hands moving through the familiar sequence while his mind wandered to dinner plans, his daughter's tuition payments, or the Tigers' prospects for the upcoming baseball season. It was honest work, sometimes monotonous, but it provided for his family and came with the satisfaction of building something tangible, something that would carry American families down highways for years to come. The morning of January 12th began like any other. Robert arrived at the plant at 5:45, 15 minutes before his shift started, as he always did. He changed into his work clothes in the locker room, exchanged brief greetings with familiar faces, and made his way through the cavernous factory floor to his station. The air smelled of machine oil and hot metal, a scent so familiar it barely registered in his consciousness anymore. The constant noise of machinery, the hiss of pneumatic tools, and the clang of metal on metal created a symphony of industrial sound that required workers to communicate through hand signals and shouted phrases. Robert's route to his station took him past Bay 7, a section of the plant that housed some of the newer computerized machinery Ford had installed over the past 2 years. The company was slowly modernizing, incorporating programmable logic controllers and early computer-aided systems that could perform certain tasks with greater precision than human workers. These machines were expensive, sophisticated, and represented Ford's effort to compete with the increasingly automated Japanese manufacturers who were capturing larger shares of the American market. Robert had mixed feelings about the automation. He understood it was necessary for Ford's competitiveness, but he also knew it meant fewer jobs for workers like him, fewer union positions that had sustained communities like Lincoln Park for generations. As Robert walked past Bay 7 that morning, something caught his attention. A man he had never seen before was standing near one of the new CNC machines, computerized lathe that could mill engine components with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The man was not dressed in the standard work coveralls that plant employees wore. Instead, he had on slacks and a button-down shirt under a Ford visitor badge clipped to his chest. Nothing unusual about that. The plant regularly hosted engineers, managers, and various technical specialists who needed access to specific equipment. But something about this particular visitor made Robert pause. The man was taking photographs. Not casual snapshots, but methodical documentation using a professional-looking camera with a telephoto lens. He was photographing the CNC machine from multiple angles, getting close-ups of the control panel, the tool carousel, and the computer interface that programmed the machine's operations. Again, this was not inherently suspicious. Ford frequently documented its equipment for training manuals, maintenance records, and engineering reviews. But the man's behavior struck Robert as odd in ways he could not immediately articulate. First, the man was working alone, with no escort or supervisor present. Ford's security protocols required that visitors be accompanied at all times, especially in sensitive manufacturing areas where proprietary technology was in use. Second, the man kept glancing around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching him, exhibiting the kind of awareness that suggested he knew he was doing something he should not be doing. Third, and most tellingly to Robert's experienced eye, the man was photographing details that seemed to have no practical purpose. He took several shots of serial numbers on the machine's housing, close-ups of the manufacturer's data plates, and detailed images of the computer code visible on the control screen. Robert slowed his pace, pretending to adjust his tool belt, while observing the man from about 30 feet away. The visitor was approximately 40 years old, with dark hair, graying at the temples and glasses that reflected the overhead fluorescent lights. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting someone familiar with technical photography. He would position himself, take several shots rapidly, check the camera display, then move to a new angle. The entire operation had the feel of rehearsed procedure, not casual documentation. Robert's instinct was to simply report what he was seeing to his foreman. The plant had security personnel whose job was to handle such matters. But something made him hesitate. He had worked at Ford long enough to understand the company's bureaucratic machinery, knew that reporting a possible security violation would likely result in nothing more than a memo being filed and forgotten. Unless he had something more concrete to report, something that clearly indicated wrongdoing, he would simply be that paranoid line worker who got nervous about a guy taking pictures. The man finished his photography and walked briskly toward the exit, passing within 20 feet of where Robert stood. As he passed, Robert got a better look at the visitor badge. It identified the man as David Mitchell, technical consultant, with an expiration date indicating the badge was valid for the day. The badge looked legitimate, with Ford's logo and the proper color coding for contractor access. But Robert noticed something that struck him as wrong. The badge was too clean, too new. Most visitor badges that contractors wore showed signs of use, accumulated the kind of wear that came from being clipped and unclipped multiple times. This badge looked like it had been created that morning. Robert made a mental note of the name and returned to his station. His shift began, and for the next 4 hours, he installed cylinder heads with the same reliable efficiency he had maintained for 2 decades. But his mind kept returning to the man with the camera, to the nervous glances, to the pristine visitor badge, to the methodical documentation of details that seemed to serve no legitimate purpose. During his lunch break, Robert sat in the cafeteria with 3 other workers from his shift, men he had known for years. He mentioned what he had seen, framing it casually as something odd, rather than something alarming. The reactions were mixed. Tom Kowalski, who had worked at Ford even longer than Robert, shrugged and said the company was always bringing in consultants to evaluate equipment and recommend modifications. Nothing unusual about that. Charlie Brennan suggested the photographs might be for an insurance assessment or an equipment upgrade proposal. But the third man, Vincent DeLuca, a Korean War veteran with sharp eyes and a tendency toward skepticism, leaned forward and asked Robert to describe exactly what he had seen. Robert went through the details again, and Vincent's expression grew serious. Vincent said that during his time in Army intelligence, he had learned that Soviet agents were constantly trying to acquire information about American manufacturing technology, particularly automated systems that had military applications. The same CNC machines that made engine components could be modified to produce precision parts for weapons systems, guidance mechanisms, even components for nuclear centrifuges. If the Soviets could obtain the programming codes and technical specifications for advanced American manufacturing equipment, they could replicate it and eliminate the technological advantages that American industry still maintained. The other men laughed nervously at Vincent's suggestion that Soviet spies might be operating inside the Ford Rouge Complex. It seemed absurd, paranoid, the kind of Cold War fantasy that belonged in movies rather than in a Michigan auto plant. But Vincent was not laughing. He told Robert that if his instincts were telling him something was wrong, he should trust those instincts and report what he had seen to plant security at minimum. Robert finished his lunch with Vincent's words echoing in his mind, uncertain whether he was being prudent or paranoid. That evening, Robert drove home through streets lined with snow, his pickup truck's heater working overtime against the January cold. He told Patricia about the incident over dinner, about the man with the camera, and Vincent's suggestion that it might be something more serious than innocent consulting work. Patricia listened carefully, as she always did, then asked Robert what he thought he should do. He said he did not know. He did not want to look foolish by reporting something that turned out to be completely innocent. But he also could not shake the feeling that what he had witnessed was wrong in some fundamental way. The next morning, Robert arrived at the plant and sought out his shift supervisor, a man named Frank Henderson, who had been with Ford for 30 years and had worked his way up from the assembly line to management. Robert explained what he had seen the previous day, keeping his tone neutral and factual. Henderson listened without interrupting, his expression revealing nothing. When Robert finished, Henderson thanked him for reporting it and said he would look into the matter. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, and Robert left feeling uncertain whether anything would actually come of his report. 3 days passed with no feedback from Henderson or anyone else in management. Robert began to think the whole thing had been forgotten, dismissed as the overactive imagination of a line worker who had watched too many spy movies. But on the 4th day, As Robert was leaving the plant at the end of his shift, a man in a suit approached him in the parking lot and identified himself as Daniel Price from Ford's corporate security division. Price asked if they could talk privately, and Robert found himself sitting in an unmarked sedan while Price asked him to describe everything he had seen in Bay 7 4 days earlier. Robert went through the story again, this time with more detail because Price asked specific questions about the camera equipment, the visitor badge, and the exact location and type of machinery being photographed. Price took extensive notes and asked Robert if he would be willing to look at some photographs to see if he could identify the man he had seen. Robert agreed, and Price produced a folder containing 8 by 10 black and white photographs of various men, all approximately the same age and general appearance. Robert examined each photograph carefully, taking his time. On the 5th image, he stopped. "That is him," Robert said. "That is the man I saw photographing the CNC equipment." Price's expression did not change, but Robert noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Price asked if Robert was certain, emphasizing that it was critically important he be absolutely sure. Robert studied the photograph again, noting the distinctive way the man's glasses sat on his face, the particular angle of his jawline, the way his hair was combed. He was certain. Price closed the folder and thanked Robert for his cooperation. Then he said something that made Robert's stomach drop. The man Robert had identified was not David Mitchell, technical consultant. His real name was Yuri Volkov, and he was a suspected officer of the KGB operating under commercial cover in the Detroit area. Ford's security division had been monitoring him for several weeks based on a tip from the FBI, but they had not been able to catch him in the act of collecting intelligence until now. Robert's observation and willingness to report what he had seen had provided the concrete evidence needed to take action. Robert felt ice water flood his veins. He asked Price what would happen next. Price explained that the FBI would be taking over the investigation, that Robert would likely need to provide a formal statement, and that the information he had provided would be classified and could not be discussed with anyone, including his family, until the case was resolved. Price emphasized that Robert had not been in danger, that Volkov was an intelligence officer, not an assassin, and that his interest was in technology, not in harming workers. But Price also made clear that Robert's cooperation was vital to national security and that he would need to continue working his normal shifts while federal investigators built their case. Over the following week, Robert met twice more with FBI agents who wanted every detail he could remember about Volkov's appearance, behavior, and photography activities. They showed him additional photographs and asked him to review floor plans of the plant, marking exactly where he had been standing and where Volkov had been positioned. They asked about other workers who might have been present, about the lighting conditions, about anything that might help them understand the full scope of Volkov's activities at the plant. The agents explained to Robert that Volkov was part of what the FBI called a technology acquisition network, a group of Soviet intelligence officers and their contacts who systematically gathered information about American industrial and military technology. The network operated through a combination of legal means, attending trade shows and purchasing commercially available equipment, and illegal means, stealing proprietary information, bribing employees, and conducting covert photography of restricted facilities. The CNC machines at Ford were of particular interest to the Soviets because the same technology used to manufacture engine components could be adapted for producing precision parts needed in ballistic missiles, aircraft, and other military applications. What made the Ford Rouge Complex an attractive target was its combination of advanced technology and relatively open access. Unlike defense contractors with classified facilities and stringent security protocols, Ford was a commercial manufacturer that regularly hosted suppliers, consultants, and various business partners who needed to see production operations. Volkov had exploited this openness by creating a false identity as a manufacturing consultant, obtaining fraudulent credentials, and using legitimate business visits as cover for intelligence collection. He had apparently been conducting similar operations at other automotive and industrial facilities throughout the Midwest, slowly assembling a comprehensive picture of American manufacturing capabilities. The FBI agents told Robert that his observation had been crucial because it had caught Volkov in the act of photographing specific technical details that clearly exceeded what any legitimate consultant would need. The serial numbers, the computer code, the manufacturer's data plates, all of this information would allow Soviet engineers to identify the exact specifications of the equipment and potentially replicate or counter it. Without Robert's report, Volkov would have continued his operations undetected, possibly for months or years, stealing technology that had cost American companies millions of dollars to develop. Robert asked the agents what would happen to him now, whether he was in any danger. The senior agent, a man named Thomas Bradford, with 20 years of counterintelligence experience, assured Robert that Volkov had no reason to know he had been identified. The FBI would build their case carefully, using Robert's testimony as one piece among many, ensuring that their investigation did not reveal its origins. When they eventually moved against Volkov, it would appear to be the result of broader surveillance, not the report of a single observant worker. For the next 3 weeks, Robert went to work each day carrying the weight of knowledge he could not share. He passed Bay 7 every morning, seeing the CNC machines that had become the focus of an international espionage case. He worked his shifts, installed cylinder heads, and maintained the appearance of normalcy while knowing that FBI agents were conducting surveillance operations throughout the plant. Patricia could tell something was troubling him, but Robert kept his promise to the FBI and said nothing beyond vague references to helping with a security matter at work. The arrest occurred on a cold morning in early February. Robert learned about it not from the FBI, but from the evening news. The television showed footage of federal agents escorting Yuri Volkov from a building in downtown Detroit, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face impassive as reporters shouted questions. The news anchor reported that Volkov, operating under the alias David Mitchell, had been charged with multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit economic espionage. The report mentioned that he had been conducting operations at several industrial facilities in the Detroit area, gathering technical information for Soviet intelligence services. The news coverage did not mention Ford specifically, or identify any of the facilities where Volkov had been active. The FBI had kept those details confidential to protect ongoing operations and to avoid revealing investigative methods. But Robert knew he was watching the conclusion of something he had started with a single observation on a January morning. He felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the matter was resolved, pride that his vigilance had contributed to catching a spy, and a lingering unease about how close the Cold War had come to his daily life. 2 days after Volkov's arrest, Agent Bradford visited Robert at his home in Lincoln Park. Patricia was present this time, having been cleared to hear the general details of what had happened. Bradford thanked Robert formally for his cooperation and explained that the investigation had been more extensive than initially apparent. Volkov had been operating in the United States for nearly 4 years under his false identity, during which time he had gathered significant amounts of technical information about American manufacturing processes, automation systems, and industrial capabilities. The arrest had been coordinated with similar operations in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where other members of Volkov's network had been taken into custody. Bradford told Robert that his willingness to report what he had seen had been instrumental in building the case against Volkov. "Many people see things that trouble them, but choose not to get involved," Bradford said. "They tell themselves it is not their problem or that someone else will handle it. Your decision to report your observations and then cooperate with our investigation probably prevented significant technology theft that would have benefited Soviet military programs. You should be proud of that." Robert asked what would happen to Volkov. Bradford explained that Volkov would likely be tried, convicted based on overwhelming evidence, and then exchanged for American intelligence personnel held by the Soviets. It was a common pattern in espionage cases, a pragmatic arrangement that both superpowers found preferable to lengthy imprisonment. Volkov would return to Moscow, where he would face consequences for his capture, while American agents would come home. Justice of a sort would be served, even if it looked different from what civilian courts usually delivered. In the weeks that followed, Robert tried to return to his normal routine. But he found himself looking at his workplace differently, seeing it not just as a factory, but as a potential target for foreign intelligence operations. He paid more attention to visitors, to people who seemed out of place, to behaviors that did not quite fit expected patterns. Vincent DeLuca, who had been right about the seriousness of Robert's initial observation, became a regular lunch companion. They would sit in the cafeteria and discuss the Cold War, the ongoing competition between superpowers, and the way that conflict manifested in places most Americans never considered. Vincent explained to Robert that the Soviet Union's industrial espionage efforts were massive and systematic. The KGB and GRU, Soviet military intelligence, had entire directorates dedicated to acquiring Western technology. They operated on the principle that stealing technology was faster and cheaper than developing it independently, and they targeted everything from computer systems to manufacturing processes to agricultural techniques. The spies were not dramatic figures from movies, but often mundane-looking people who blended into business environments, presenting themselves as consultants, trade representatives, or academic researchers. Robert learned from Vincent that the Ford Rouge Complex, despite being a commercial facility, was considered strategically significant because of its advanced manufacturing capabilities and its historical importance to American industrial power. During World War II, the Rouge had been a prime target for German sabotage attempts, and during the Cold War, it remained on Soviet target lists for intelligence collection. The technology Ford developed for producing automobiles efficiently had direct applications to military manufacturing, and the Soviets were keenly interested in understanding American production methods. Several months after Volkov's arrest, Robert received a letter from the FBI director commending him for his assistance in a counterintelligence investigation of national importance. The letter was carefully worded to avoid specific details, suitable for his personnel file, but revealing nothing classified. Robert framed it and hung it in his garage, where he could look at it while working on his truck. Patricia understood its significance, even if the letter itself was vague. It represented recognition that her husband had done something important, had served his country in an unexpected way. The case had broader implications that Robert only learned about gradually through conversations with FBI agents and occasional news reports. The investigation triggered by his observation had led to the identification of a broader Soviet intelligence network operating throughout the Midwest. 7 additional individuals were eventually arrested or expelled from the United States. Dozens of companies tightened their security protocols, and the FBI developed new guidelines for protecting industrial facilities from foreign intelligence collection. Robert's co-workers at Ford knew only that he had helped with some kind of security investigation. The details remained classified, but word spread that Robert Callahan had spotted something important and reported it. Some workers treated him with new respect. Others teased him good-naturedly about being a spy hunter. A few maintained distance, uncomfortable with the idea that federal investigations had been conducted at their workplace. Robert handled the attention with characteristic modesty, deflecting questions and focusing on his work. But the experience had changed him in subtle ways. He had spent 23 years viewing his job as simply a means of earning a living, a way to provide for his family and build security. Now he understood that his work was part of something larger, that the engines he helped assemble contributed to American economic strength, and that strength mattered in the ongoing global competition with the Soviet Union. His labor was not just about paycheck and benefits. It was about maintaining the industrial capacity that undergirded American power and prosperity. Vincent DeLuca articulated this realization one afternoon as they ate lunch. "You know what you did that really mattered?" Vincent said. "You paid attention. Most people go through their workday in a fog, doing their jobs, but not really seeing what is around them. You saw something wrong, and you acted on it. That is what citizenship looks like in the modern world. Not just voting and paying taxes, but being aware of your surroundings and taking responsibility when you notice something that threatens the country." Robert thought about this observation frequently. He had never considered himself particularly patriotic in any demonstrative way. He did not fly flags or attend political rallies. His service to his country had been quiet and unintentional, born from instinct rather than ideology. But Vincent was right, that his willingness to notice and report had mattered. In the shadow war of espionage and counterintelligence, victories often came not from dramatic operations, but from ordinary people who paid attention and trusted their instincts. The Ford Rouge Complex continued operating through the 1980s and beyond, weathering the economic challenges that reshaped American manufacturing. Robert worked there until his retirement in 2001, accumulating 41 years of service. He trained younger workers, adapted to new technologies, and watched as automation transformed the plant he had known for decades. But he never forgot that January morning when he noticed a man with a camera and trusted his instinct that something was wrong. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Robert would occasionally read declassified accounts of espionage operations conducted during the 1980s. He learned that the network Volkov had been part of was even more extensive than initially understood, that Soviet intelligence had successfully penetrated dozens of American industrial facilities, and that the technology they stole had accelerated Soviet military programs by years. He learned that cases like his, where alert citizens noticed and reported suspicious activities, were rare but invaluable to counterintelligence efforts. Robert never sought publicity for his role in the Volkov case. When journalists occasionally contacted him after details were declassified, he declined interviews. He did not want recognition or attention. He had simply done what seemed right at the time, trusted an instinct that something was wrong, and followed through by reporting what he had seen. That countless other workers had walked past Bay 7 without noticing Volkov's suspicious behavior made Robert's observation no less ordinary in his own mind. He had simply been paying attention. But in the classified files of the FBI, in the after-action reports written by counterintelligence analysts, Robert Callahan's name appears with the notation that his report initiated Operation Steel Curtain, the investigation that dismantled a significant Soviet technology acquisition network operating in the American Midwest. The operation prevented the theft of advanced manufacturing technology valued at millions of dollars and exposed intelligence tradecraft that helped the FBI improve security protocols at industrial facilities nationwide. The story of how Robert Callahan spotted a KGB officer photographing CNC equipment at Ford illustrates a truth often overlooked in accounts of Cold War espionage. The conflict between superpowers was not fought only in Berlin or Vienna or other exotic locations featured in spy novels. It was fought in factories and research facilities and office buildings throughout America, conducted by intelligence officers who looked like ordinary business people, and thwarted by citizens who were simply alert enough to notice when something did not fit the normal pattern. On Robert's final day at Ford, his co-workers threw him a retirement party in the cafeteria. There were speeches about his reliability and dedication, jokes about his reluctance to embrace new technology, and genuine affection from men who had worked beside him for decades. No one mentioned the Volkov case directly, but Vincent DeLuca raised his coffee cup in a toast and said that Robert Callahan had proven that paying attention mattered, that ordinary vigilance was extraordinary service. The other workers might not have understood the full reference, but Robert knew what Vincent meant, and he appreciated being acknowledged by someone who understood the significance of what he had done. Patricia attended the retirement party, watching her husband receive recognition for a career of honest labor. She knew the classified details of the Volkov case, knew that Robert had been part of something important that would never be fully public. She was proud of him not just for spotting the spy, but for his characteristic humility about it, for his insistence that he had simply done what anyone should do. That most people would not have noticed or would not have reported what Robert saw made his contribution more significant, but Robert himself would never accept that assessment. In his retirement, Robert Callahan lived quietly in the same Lincoln Park house he had bought decades earlier. He worked in his garden, maintained his truck, visited his grandchildren, and followed Detroit Tigers baseball with the dedication of a lifelong fan. He did not dwell on his brief intersection with the world of espionage. It had been an extraordinary episode in an otherwise ordinary life, a moment when his instincts and his willingness to act had served his country in an unexpected way. But sometimes, driving past the Ford Rouge Complex on his way to visit his daughters, Robert would think about that January morning in 1983. He would remember the man with the camera, the nervous glances, the too clean visitor badge. He would remember the decision to report what he had seen despite uncertainty and the fear of looking foolish. And he would remember Agent Bradford's words. Many people see things that trouble them, but choose not to get involved. Your decision to report made a difference. Those words remained with Robert for the rest of his life, a reminder that citizenship required more than following laws and paying taxes. It required attention, awareness, and the courage to act when something seemed wrong. The Cold War had been won not just through military strength or diplomatic maneuvering, but through the accumulated vigilance of ordinary people who refused to look away when they noticed threats to their country. Robert James Callahan died in 2018 at the age of 82. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his 41 years at Ford, his service to his union, and his devotion to his family. It did not mention the KGB officer he had spotted or the espionage network his observation had helped dismantle. Those details remained classified, known only to the handful of FBI agents and counterintelligence analysts who understood the significance of what Robert had done. But in the secret history of the Cold War, in the classified accounts of how America protected its technological advantages from Soviet intelligence operations, there is a chapter about a Ford factory worker who paid attention at exactly the right moment. That chapter acknowledges Robert Callahan as representative of the countless ordinary Americans whose Dasuon Vigilance protected their country during decades of shadow war. They never wore uniforms or received medals. They simply noticed when something was wrong and trusted themselves enough to report it. And in doing so, they proved that national security depends not only on intelligence agencies and military forces, but on citizens who remain aware, alert, and willing to act. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.